We're really being asked three questions if you read the little introductory paragraph to this program. Number one, why didn't the new Middle East emerge? Number two, comes third, but nonetheless it's really number two, is it in our power to help trigger a change in the Middle East to move it in a positive direction? And number three, are we doomed to face a Middle East of extremism and fundamentalism, etc.? And in 8 minutes I'll try and address that. I'd already lost 30 seconds. Look, the reason why this peaceful era that so many people hoped would emerge back in 1993 didn't, in my judgment, has to be connected to the change in the geostrategic conditions that launched the peace process and how they basically eroded within a few years after the signing of the Oslo agreements. When the peace process began, first at Madrid and then secondly at Oslo, three important global developments had occurred. Number one, the Soviet Union had collapsed. And if you remember, the Soviet Union had been really the backbone of the war option against the state of Israel for so many years. Number two, Iraq was eliminated from our Eastern Front. And number three, Iran hadn't yet recovered from an 8-year war with Iraq. And it seemed that Iran had lost its revolutionary zeal with the waves of young children who fought against the Iraqi army, and that Iran was neutralized and wouldn't be a factor in our part of the world. Within just a very short amount of time, these conditions completely changed. When I actually went into government in 1996, I saw suddenly that Russia, which had inherited the former Soviet Union's position, was suddenly engaged in weapons transfers and technology transfers to this region that even the old Soviet Union wouldn't be involved with. For example, missile technology. There had been limits placed by superpower understanding. Those limits were off. Iraq remained Iraq, that was not a changed factor. But Iran suddenly showed an enormous amount of regional activism. We saw it in Lebanon. We had 2 military operations in the 90s in Lebanon. We saw it also in Saudi Arabia with the attack on the Khobar Towers, which was an operation of Saudi Hezbollah together with Lebanese Hezbollah. We saw operations against the Israeli embassy and the Amia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires. And we saw operations of Hezbollah in Europe and as far as Singapore and the Philippines. So suddenly, Iran wasn't this quietist state that we thought it would be, but it was already affecting the Middle East balance of power. Now, one of the questions that frequently comes up among Israelis who visit abroad is whether Israel, by working to reach an understanding with our Palestinian neighbors, can somehow change these difficult trends. And I would throw into it a fourth trend which frankly was not really part of our Middle Eastern reality but affected the periphery of the Middle East, and that's the emergence of Al-Qaeda after 1989, which primarily affected more remote places like Afghanistan or Chechnya or Kashmir, but didn't really become part of the heart of the Middle East until after the Iraq War. What we are frequently asked is whether Israel can somehow affect the growth of, let's say, Al-Qaeda and radical Islamic extremism. And the assertion is frequently made that should Israel take further risks for peace, we would be able to lower the flames of radical Islamic rage, and therefore contribute to the interests of the United States, the European Union, and other actors in the region. My very firm view, having studied this extensively, is that there is no correlation between what Israel does in the peace process and the phenomenon that we are contending with radical Islam. If you go back to the decade of the 90s, you'll see Israel signed the Oslo agreements in 1993. We reached the first Gaza-Jericho Accord in 1994, the interim agreement on the West Bank in 95, the Hebron agreement in 1997, Y Conference in 1998, and finally Camp David in the year 2000. In that same period, where there was unprecedented energy put into working out the differences between Israelis and Palestinians, what happened on the stage of the global Islamic threat? 93, prior to Oslo, we had the first World Trade Center attack. 95, we had the first Al-Qaeda attack in Saudi Arabia. 1998, 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa were attacked by Al-Qaeda. 2000, the USS Cole, and finally September 11th, 2001, New York and Washington. In other words, our efforts in this part of the world did not affect that growing threat. They're simply unconnected. What can be done to deal with the problems of this region? Who are the factors that should take responsibility? Well, Israel has its own interest in reaching understandings with its neighbors and will pursue those understandings. But if I had to identify two fundamental problems, and I'm sure other panelists will speak about some of them, one, of course, is the factor of Iran. And today we're seeing the factor of Iran destabilize and destroy our northern neighbor, Lebanon. And I won't expand on it, because again, others will, but I'm going to raise another country which most people don't really think about here very frequently. And that country is called Saudi Arabia. Many of us see Saudi Arabia as a potential peace partner because we both face the Iranian threat. A lot of that was talked about prior to the Annapolis peace process. But I have to share with you, having written a book on Saudi Arabia has been the source of much of the radical Islamic rage in the Sunni world, from Algeria and Morocco across to as far as the Far East. Just 1 month ago, the Los Angeles Times carried a story quoting Stuart Lee, the Undersecretary of the Treasury of the United States, who is responsible for dealing with the challenge of terrorist financing. And I want to read this to you. Saudi Arabia today remains the location where more money is going to terrorism, to Sunni terror groups, and to the Taliban than any other place in the world. Now, there's an institutionalized interest in a lot of different quarters of the international community to not address the Saudi problem. But to me, if the international community has a firm responsibility, if it wants to see a changed Middle East, if it wants to see a new Middle East, it really has to do two things. It has to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Easier said than done. I know the EU3 were very active in trying to negotiate with the Iranians for at least 3 years, and until a former Iranian negotiator said, well, we completed our conversion process in Isfahan while we talked. We have to do a lot more to stop Iran. And second of all, despite the enormous financial interests that are involved and the influence that Saudi Arabia exercises in world capitals and in Washington, D.C., a concerted effort has to finally be made to stop Saudi financing and Saudi support for ideological support for radical Islamic groups in the Sunni world. If these two elements are not done, nobody can come to Israel and say, it's up to you to energize the Middle East and create the new Middle East. It must begin there. We'll do our part as well. Thank you.